As part of my theology training, I had to do an assignment which was comparing and contrasting different worship services. And it was during the pandemic, so we were sent to a website to look at, which is a website called Mystery Worshipper. And it's a site where people offer their feedback and assessment on a visit to a church. And it's quite interesting. So it's from anything about what clothes might be worn, to what coffee is drunk, to how long the sermon might be, and to the songs sung. And I suppose what it does is it gives an idea to people of what the service is like before they go. And in some ways perhaps holds up a mirror to the church itself, of this is how you come across. So I spent some time looking at this site, but I did also visit some churches. I went to a very rural church where we started outside to worship and then moved into a barn. And then I went to a more higher church, if you like, where there were lots of smells and bells and different language to decipher. And it was fascinating. They all prioritized the message of Jesus. But I'm sure, as you can imagine, the welcome was very different in all of those occasions. And it's interesting, isn't it, to put ourselves, if you like, in newcomers' shoes, particularly if we've been here a while. I actually did a similar talk on welcome a few weeks ago. I'm not going to make you do it now, but I asked the people listening to move seats at this point, to find a different seat in church. Because for some of us, we can become quite rooted in a certain place. And that can be challenging. If you're new to the church, you don't want to sit down in the wrong place. So we're going to think about welcome this morning. I imagine you've all got an experience, not necessarily of just being welcomed into church, but any community group that you might be part of. Was it a good experience? Or perhaps it was a challenging experience. And you'll know the difference between the two. But importantly, I don't want us just to think about what it's like for a newcomer, but also what it's like as we know each other here to a certain extent, but we're a big family. What is it to welcome each other after months or years of perhaps being alongside each other, perhaps not necessarily knowing each other's names, but recognizing faces? And welcome and hospitality is actually one of our 5 priorities that we set as a church back in April. And you'll know, some of you who've been here a while, that back in May we transformed the back of church with a splash of colour and changed a few things, and we're really grateful to the team who did that. But that's the physical infrastructure. So today, as a Christchurch family, we want to think a bit more about how do we continue that welcome. Whether you'd say, I'm new around here, or whether you'd say, I've been here for years. We all have a part to play in welcoming each other and those that are in our community. So I've got 3 questions for us today. What is welcome? Who welcomes? And where does welcome start? So firstly, what is welcome? I think sometimes welcome can be reduced simply to a handshake, perhaps pre-COVID, or a smile, a wave, or even just handing someone a cup of tea. And don't get me wrong, these are great things. But I want to just turn our attention to a key verse in the passage of Romans that we looked at in verse 7, because it gives a much deeper understanding of welcome. So Paul writes in Romans 15, verse 7, welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. Welcome from this verse is rooted in the example of Christ. Welcome one another as Christ welcomes you. And how did Christ welcome us? Each one of us. Well, he opened his arms of love on the cross. That was Jesus' welcome. A costly welcome. And if we were to read a few chapters earlier in Romans 15, he welcomed us when we were sinners. when we were enemies, when we had our backs turned, he showed us the ultimate example of love, of welcome. That's the story of the cross that we'll remember as we come and share the Lord's Supper together. It's an extravagant, costly welcome that unites us as one family, because we're united to God through Jesus, but we're also united as we come together as brothers and sisters around the person of Jesus. We're united together as one family. We are welcomed in together. And of course, Jesus' welcome isn't restricted to that one-off event at Calvary, but it's an ongoing desire for relationship. It's invitational. As the famous verse in Revelation 3, verse 20 says, "Here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with them, and they with me." Jesus welcomes us at his table. That's a kind of intimate way of really getting to know someone, isn't it? It's not just standing having a conversation. When you sit around a meal table, that's when you get to know someone well. And as we know from perhaps the Gospels, Jesus welcomed all sorts of people and ate with all sorts, whether they were outcasts, religious leaders, the unclean, the wealthy, the corrupt. They were gathered and invited to spend time with Jesus. And it's interesting, actually, that Paul, when he was writing this letter to the Romans, at the time, there was significant tension between the Jews and the Gentiles. And he writes, "Welcome as Christ has welcomed you." It's a reminder, isn't it, that welcome is radical, that it crosses boundaries, that there's no limits, there's no bias. It should transcend culture and language and status, all for the glory of God. So really simply, if you've welcomed Jesus into your heart, if you follow Jesus, then we should be seeking to copy his example of welcome with each other in this place and with those in our community. And on the one hand, it's perhaps not too hard. You know, you imagine your home. When you welcome someone into your home, you plump up the cushions, you perhaps buy some flowers, you think about what food to cook. I make Andy do the hoovering, so we've got a ridiculous hoover. You might have set jobs to make that house really, really nice. And that bit's probably not too hard. But to be truthful with you, I've been to some very messy houses, but had a much better welcome. Because actually to be welcomed is to be truly heard, to be truly valued, to be seen, to be listened to. While Andy was doing his vicar training, I would gather occasionally with vicars' wives-to-be, and we had some discussions about what it would be like to sort of have that role. And I remember distinctly at the time someone saying, "Make sure when you have guests your house that you spend as much time preparing your house as you do praying for your guests." I thought that was really interesting. It's not just about the physical environment, but it's about the people before us. Are we listening? Are they valued? Are they seen? And are they heard? And it's easy to welcome people who are like us, isn't it? It's easy to welcome those that we have common ground with, those that we don't mind spending time with. But of course, it's much harder to do that with people who are different to us, or people we perhaps find difficult. And actually, in our passage today, Paul encourages us to be other-centered. So at the end of verse 1 and 2, we're encouraged not to please ourselves, but verse 2 says, each of us should please our neighbours for their good, to build them up. And as we do this, as we become other-centered, we put others' needs before our own, life could look quite different. And I was reading further challenging words this week in Luke 6, that it's not enough to just love those who love us. Because as Jesus says, even sinners do that. Instead, we're encouraged to love our enemies, and to love those that hate us. Hopefully, as you look around, there aren't too many enemies here. But we are all different. We've got different needs, different wants, different desires. And as Paul reminds us here, we are to be other-centered as we become one family, as we get to know each other, as we show this costly way of loving and welcoming. We're going to need Jesus' help. We're going to need to be reminded of this example of agape love, of that willingness to lay down our lives for others, to put them first. A sentimental smile goes some way, but we're talking about a much deeper form of welcome. And it can be costly and it can be hard. But I believe as we do that, and I believe we do that here in many ways, as we do that, that love will flow out from this place. That you will take the welcome that you found in Jesus, and share that with others. We talk about being one family following Jesus, but our heart's desire is to grow community as well. And as Archbishop William Temple reminds us, the church is a community that exists for the benefit of those who are not yet its members. So our welcome, prayerfully, should be to be filled with Jesus' love and light, and to overflow that to the lost and the least and the broken in our world. So what is welcome? Well, welcome is looking to Jesus and copying his example of love, expressing that to everyone, no matter who they are. So that's what's welcome. Who welcomes? We've perhaps alluded to this already, but I just want to expand for a moment to help us to understand. And to just draw this out, I want to ask you a question. Would you consider yourself a guest or a host in this church? There's a difference, isn't there, between the two roles. If I came to your house, I would be a guest and you would be the host, and you'd perhaps make sure that I had a drink or perhaps a little bit of food, and you'd welcome me. Now, if we apply that principle to church, perhaps I can ask this question. Could you be sure next Sunday that any stranger that walks into church would be well hosted by any member of the congregation? I don't mean the welcome team and those that host that space at the back, but I mean any member of the congregation. Because this is the heart of who welcomes. Welcoming is the job for us all, from the very youngest to the very oldest member. Because, of course, it's no use someone being really well welcomed at the door and then coming to find their seat and everyone else ignores them. It's possible, isn't it, to feel alone in a crowd. And there's a lot of us here today. So I wonder how you found it. I did speak to someone brand new who came into church this morning. I can't see them now. I'm not going to look at them. But have they got someone around them that said hello, that's making them feel welcome and a part of our family? So are you a guest or are you a host in this congregation? Because actually it's possible, if we're honest, we might have been here 1, 2, 5, 10 plus years more, that we could still be acting like a guest when it comes to thinking about welcome. And this week I was reading the story of the Good Samaritan, probably familiar to all of us in Luke 10, the story of a traveller who's on the road and gets injured, in need of help, and 3 different people pass by, but only one person stops to help. The priest and the Levite, the people who we would have expected, who had jobs and responsibility and authority and influence, should have stopped. But by contrast, in that story, we hear the Samaritan, the most unlikely person, the one rejected in society, the outsider. He had no obligation, no expectation to stop, no incentive to love and show welcome to that man, and yet he goes out of his way to show that love and welcome. And aside from that, the innkeeper actually as well. who had to care, ongoing care and love and hospitality for that man. You know, this story reminded me that welcome is not something we do because of our role. Oh, I'm not on the welcome team, so I don't need to think about that. We all have a part to play because of our love for Jesus. And we want to share that with those around us. Some might argue, perhaps in that story, that the Levite and the priest, well, they didn't stop, did they? Because they were following the Mosaic law, which said that they would defile themselves by helping this wounded man. And they wouldn't be able to perform their duties. Well, that again was just a reminder to me, actually, that being welcoming, offering this welcome, being interrupted in our everyday routines or our everyday moment within the church family might be costly. We're all welcomers. And a number of years ago, I heard the story that my father-in-law tells of when he was preaching at a church. He'd asked a member of the congregation who'd been away on holiday for 3 weeks, whilst he was away, to grow a beard. And when he came back to church, he was to come, if you like, as a homeless man. He was to come disheveled. He was to come in very old clothes, dirty clothes, smelly clothes. He was to dress in this way and to come into church. And I wonder whether you can imagine what the reaction was. Well, let me say the illustration was like a punch in the stomach to the congregation. People moved away. Parents pulled their children away. This man was left to sit on his own. And during the sermon, when my father-in-law was speaking, he sort of revealed who he was. And it was, as I say, a bit of a punch in the stomach. Everyone is called to be a welcomer. So that's who welcomes, it's all of us. And lastly, much more briefly, where does welcome start? I love chatting to people who come in new to church. And one of the questions I love to ask them is, how did you hear about Christchurch? And perhaps it won't surprise you, but increasingly, due to our connected world, most people have watched a service online. Most people have gone on the YouTube channel, they know what to expect, and therefore, they've perhaps already in some way experienced a welcome online, which is interesting. So this question of where does welcome start? Well, it's a bit of a tough one. It could be online. It could be the people who walk past. This is quite a footfall of people going into Beeston, getting the tram, going to work. What do the church notice boards say to our community? I don't know if you can read that writing, but the big sign says welcome, and the smaller sign says keep off the grass. You know, these guys who are part of the garden team here do a fantastic job. The garden is beautiful. I don't think we have a problem. I think people love to see the things that are going on, the different eco things that are happening. But actually, for some people, that might be at the beginning of their journey with church. What does it look like? How welcoming is it? But I think much more importantly is to think about the fact that you and I are the welcome. You and I are the welcome. How we show Jesus' love, how we talk about church and the activities that we are involved in, whether we invite people in, is all part of the welcome. And we could progress this further because once the welcome has started, the welcome needs to continue. As I said, that first-time visitor who comes in, are they greeted warmly? What happens next? Do people get cross that they're sat in so-and-so's place? This is a funny cartoon. Do they understand the format of the service? When I was visiting those churches that I mentioned at the beginning, it was actually really helpful that someone began to explain what was going to happen in one of these services. Although I've been a Christian for many years, I felt a bit like a stranger in a foreign land. The different language, the different way that things happened. So we would do well to put ourselves in the shoes of a newcomer. Why not be the first to start a conversation with someone around you at the end of this service? Maybe you've seen that person a million times, but you can't remember their name. Let's get over that embarrassment and just say hello and get to know them. And then think, how could I get to know, how could I welcome someone beyond a Sunday? And I know that many of you are part of life groups and get to know one another really well, and there's a welcoming environment in that space. But there are other church activities, other things that go on that are ways in which we could begin to welcome further people into our church family. As I finish, I want to finish with this question. I read it in a book I was reading about mission, and I found it quite challenging. I think it's on the screen. If we believed that God had sent the person who came through the door of church, how might our welcome change? It's interesting, isn't it? Because you're all here on Sunday, and many of you come very regularly, which is wonderful. But not everyone wakes up on a Sunday morning and comes to church. It's not an accidental thing that people cross the threshold here. A few weeks ago, I spoke to someone who came to our church for the first time, and they said, I was driving to try a different church, but for some reason, I drove past that church and I ended up being here. I don't really know why. God had led that person to walk through the doors here. It's highly significant when someone crosses the door of church, perhaps for the first time. It might even be, you might even say, it's a holy moment where we should recognize that God has a purpose and a plan for each one of us. And as we begin to realize how much God loves every human being and what God did through Jesus, we will recognize the preciousness of each person, whatever their differences, even if they're very different to us. And I pray that, as Paul writes in Romans 15, that we would welcome one another as Christ has welcomed us for the glory of God. Amen.